Well, good afternoon, Methodist College community. What a great day we have here to celebrate Women's History Month. We have a special guest with us today. We have Mary Sparks Thompson. Wonderful, incredible individual. I have the pleasure of knowing her personally and professionally, and I'm so excited that she agreed to be here with us today. She has a lot to share. I've gotten a snippet of some of her discussion, and I'm really excited about what it's going to mean for the college and our college community. So just a little bit about Mary. So Mary Sparks Thompson is the president of UnityPoint Health, UnityPlace, and she leads a diverse team of experts in psychiatry, mental health, and addiction medicine. She has more than 25 years of leadership and executive experience. And Mary has served in operational and quality and safety roles in both hospital and community-based organizations. Mary received her Bachelor of Arts from Luther College, majoring in nursing before earning a Master of Social Work from the University of Iowa. Mary is committed to expanding and innovating behavioral health services to provide the best possible care to the Central Illinois community. Mary has been an exceptional partner for Methodist College, if you didn't know that, and I look forward to continued partnerships and listening to what you have today, listening to what you have to share with us today. So, warm welcome to Mary Sparks Thompson, everyone. Thank you. So, Mary, I know you've come here to speak to us about some things that are really important to you today. One of those being Title IX. So, just for those who may not be as familiar with Title IX, can you tell us a little bit about Title IX?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little bit and read the actual text of Title IX. Title IX was a law that was passed to enhance the Civil Rights Act, and it was passed in 1972. And so here's my source is Wikipedia, but the entry says Title IX is the most commonly used name for the federal civil rights law in the United States that was enacted as a part of the Education Amendments of 1982. It prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or any other education program that receives funding from the federal government. And so the 39 actual words that are in the text, let's see, let me make sure I've got them here. Yeah, it's no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation or be denied participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal assistance.
So why was it passed?
Well, women were not equally participating in sports, and women were not protected from discrimination based on their sex in the institutes of higher learning.
Interesting. And you said it was passed in
1972.
So when you think about Title IX, I know that there are some considerations for making a determination as if there's an issue with compliance. And I've heard of this three-pronged approach.
Yes. So there's 3 tests that each institution of higher learning has to meet in order to prove compliance with Title IX. Some of the controversy around Title IX has to do with these tests, and the tests or actually, let me restate that. Each institution has to have a Title IX compliance officer whose sole responsibility is to make sure that the institution complies with the three-pronged test. So the three tests are proportional numbers of males and females participating in sports, whether or not the school is making an effort to increase the number of the underrepresented sex, and if the school has a certain history of one specific sex dominating the numbers of athletes in any given sport, and whether or not the school is showing an effort to expand the programs to the other sex. So it's not necessarily a one-for-one exchange, and the difficulty has been really around the proportionality. So of your enrolled students, what proportion of each gender is participating? And then looking at the participation in the various sports in terms of the proportionality between the genders. So it creates some controversy. Some men's programs had to be discontinued as the institution interpreted the proportionality or any one of these other tests as not being fully compliant with that with the standards of Title IX. So that's where a lot of men started saying, why am I being now discriminated against, or the feeling that they were being discriminated because their programs were withdrawn. One interesting point of contention that a lot of folks that are support Title IX will point to is the participation in football. So football programs in colleges and universities tend to be very large, and they're not a mixed gender activity. So you don't have a women's football team. So how do you even out the opportunities and the participation when you have one sport that's dominated by one gender?
Now, doesn't that mean that the school just has to have another program with the equal number?
Correct.
To mitigate that?
But with any law, it's the interpretation and the application of the standard that can get people in trouble. You know, and it can create some controversy because of how people are interpreting it, how the NCAA is enforcing it, and all of those things that come along with the law like that.
Now, I don't know if you know this, but Methodist College has an undefeated record for our football team. We are undefeated.
That's awesome.
But we do have a Title IX officer here on site. Does anyone know who our Title IX officer is? Tyler Smith. And while we don't have sports team, I jest, we are very much involved in Title IX and the protections that Title IX affords us in other ways. Can anyone in the audience think of a way that we consider Title IX here at Methodist College? Pregnancy, right. Mary, you clearly are an athlete, right? I mean,
just wearing the fancy outfit today, or fancy
outfit,
shoes,
and you do
the
have
visor.
Oops, sorry, buddy. A bandana on with some interesting little things on there.
This is the Luther College insignia or a symbol here. It's the Norse. So if anybody knows, I mean, the Norse, you know, of Luther College have a pretty strong tradition of athletic programs throughout their history. So yeah.
Norse, is that an animal?
No. Oh. No, a Norseman is a Viking.
Oh, see, it looks like you have a fox or something.
No.
Oh, those are Viking.
Yeah, it's a Viking helmet. Yeah.
You all see, I'm in scary movie mode here, so I'm thinking everything is some type of monster.
No, the King of Norway comes to Luther every once in a while. There's ties there. Yeah, it's true.
All right, so tell us about your experience with sports.
So I had to like go back and think what year I started sports, because it's been a long time ago. But 1978, I started, I had a short stint in softball and basketball. And but I discovered I had no eye-hand coordination, so I needed to choose a sport that wouldn't involve throwing or catching or shooting a ball. And it was running, and I actually had an older brother who ran, and so I ran junior high all the way through college in both track and cross country.
And I understand, just because I know you personally, that your sons are very much involved in running as well.
Yeah, I have 3 sons, and all 3 of them ran. 2 of the 3 ran all the way through college as well. So there's been a lot of enjoyment over the years sharing that love of running with them.
And relative to Women's History Month, tell us a little bit about women and running.
So women in running, there's so many stories and so many different directions I could go here. But probably the thing that I think about the most and that I think would be fun to share with you all today is the history of participation in running. And a lot of people probably don't know, and I had to write all this down because I don't have it committed to memory. So I'm going to look at my notes here. But I use the Olympics as a potential, I still feel like I'm too loud, sorry, way to describe or to illustrate the lack of participation that was afforded to women. I can't find my notes now. I do know that in 1896, was the first Olympics. Why can I not find that note? Here it is. And there were no women's events in 1896. Then in 1928, women were afforded the opportunity to participate, and there were 3 events that they participated in. the 100-meter dash, the 4x100, which is a relay, and then the 800-meter run. At that, so they continued with, so 1928, so the next 4 years would have been 1932. So in the 1932 Olympics, it was a very hot day, and I don't remember where the Olympics was at, but the women ran the 800, and it was a very hot day, and at the end of the race, many of the women collapsed. And not uncommon. I mean, you see that if you watch running events, you'll see that happen. Well, the response to that concern for women was that the 800-meter was withdrawn as an event from the Olympics from 1932 until 1960.
Now, this is because women were passing out.
Correct.
And it had nothing to do, probably, with the fact that they had on all kinds of heavy clothing and long clothing. And
it was a hot day. It was a hot day. So it's not unknown for an athlete to just succumb to the heat in that kind of event. But again, it was for however many years, from 1960 to 1932, that women could not run the 800-meter run, which is half a mile. I mean, it's not that long. It's not that long. Then I'm going to kind of take you through the rest of the history. So just for contrast, I was born in 1964. So it's interesting to me that in 1960, it was 4 years before I was born, that women were allowed to run a half a mile on the track, a half a mile. Then in 1972, the 1,500 meters was introduced. So 12 years later then, let's let them run 1,500 meters. Then in 1984, I was a sophomore in college in 1984. Wow, we get to run now, not the 1,500, but the 3,000 meters. The 400-meter hurdles, which I had kind of like forgotten about, but the 400-meter hurdles weren't even allowed until 1984. And this was probably my favorite Olympics, because in 1984 was the first women's marathon. And one of the runners I'll be sharing with you a little bit later won that in Los Angeles in the stadium. So I'll tell you a little bit about Joan when we get to that. But again, 1984, a sophomore in college, and the 3,000 meters, the 400-meter hurdles, and the marathon. But there's still more. So it wasn't until 1988 that the 10,000-meter event was added to track. Then in 1996, the 5,000-meter run replaced the 3,000. The men didn't run the 3,000. That was a 2-mile event. It really wasn't it wasn't sanctioned on the world stage. So anyway, it was just odd that they kept the 3,000. And this was in 1996. And then in 2008, and I had kind of forgotten this as well, the steeplechase was added. So again, this was 2008. It's not that long ago that the 3,000-meter steeplechase was finally added for women. So I think now every Olympic event in track and field that men compete in, women compete in as well. But it's taken that long. And that span, to me, from 1932 to 1960, before women were even allowed to run a half a mile on the track, is just staggering.
It's so interesting to hear you mention, like in 1984 and 1988, that there still wasn't equity in these races. No. I mean, I remember being very much alive and well, and being in high school myself, and I just did not have the awareness that there wasn't equity. That is amazing to think about, that we weren't able to run the same races. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Mm-hmm. What do you think the future is for running? But before you talk about that, I do want to go back to the women that were not able to complete the 800-meter race because of the heat, because I know we talked about this a little bit personally, and I was so intrigued by this discussion, and you called it, I think you said a running kit.
Yeah.
To describe what women use, or I guess anyone uses to run in, and the differences and the discussions around the differences between men and women.
Yeah, so this was an interesting conversation I had with my youngest son, who's finishing up his schooling at Luther, and he's in sociology, so he's studying, and of course he has an interest in sports, and we were just kind of talking about his track experience, and And I asked him, I said, you know, the women's running kits, like, what do you guys think of the bun shorts and the crop tops? I mean, I just asked him, I said, what do you think about that? He goes, well, we don't think a thing of it. But as we talked more about that, I said, well, why wouldn't the men wear crop tops and bun shorts? I mean, if there's a competitive advantage to wear crop tops and bun shorts, the men would probably be in them. So to me, it's a gender-specific attire that's really has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with how a woman looks on the track. The secondary concern I have about that is eating disorders and disordered eating are rampant, especially in the sport of running. And when you are in a crop top and bun shorts, it leads you down the path of unrealistic body images and body types. So it invites comparison. Doesn't enhance the competitive advantage. Now, some elite female athletes will say, hey, you know, that's my gear. When I'm in my racing kit, I'm ready to go. And so I respect that too. But I think there's some reason to kind of think about that. Like, why do women dress so differently and skimpily, quite frankly? It's like running in bikinis, is really what it boils down to.
I noticed that in volleyball.
Oh, volleyball is terrible. Beach volleyball, terrible.
But I never noticed that in running before, because it just seemed like a really technical sport, and I didn't know if the kit had anything to do with performance, to your point.
Yeah.
But very interesting. Well, back to the question about the future. What do you think about the future of especially running, given the strides that have been made? And
I think there's a lot. Interestingly, we're still evolving women's equal participation in running. As an example, I was looking back when my youngest son was in Iowa, and we were very closely involved with both the girls and the boys cross-country teams. And the high school that he went to, the girls team had won state several years in a row. But what stood out to me is it wasn't until 2015 that they changed for Iowa high school girls from a 4K race, which is about 2.5 miles, to the 5K race, which is the same the boys run and what they would run in college. They had kept that until 2015. Like, why? Like, what is it? So I think we'll continue to see any place that there's those discrepancies in opportunities and equal, distances being the same and that sort of thing, that will continue to evolve. I think one of the interesting things that's going on in sport right now is transgender athletes and looking at how to consider transgender athletes at all levels of competition. And the main question really comes down to testosterone levels, as I understand, and I haven't done a deep dive on this because I just haven't followed it that closely. But of course, the controversy would be, is there an advantage for a transgender athlete competing in a women's event?
Right.
So that's, I think, going to be something that we're going to have to continue to wrestle with.
Yeah, I don't know what sport it was, but I thought was it swimming or?
It was swimming, where there was a transgender.
It was ranked very low as a male.
Male to female transitioning athlete, and competed in the women's NCAA championships, I believe. And there was a lot of controversy. Now, what you get into is at what point in the transition is the athlete. So someone who's early in their transition and may not be receiving the hormone replacement therapy would have more levels of testosterone than someone who's further in their treatment and their care. And I know just a very tiny little bit about it, but as I understand it, this individual was further along in the transition. But just the physical appearance of a male versus a female athlete is still different depending on the state of transition. So in swimming, I mean, the men have, broad shoulders and long arms, are well muscled, and the women are also broad shouldered, long armed, and well muscled, but it's just a different physical appearance.
Well, it makes you wonder about the origins of sports and why there was a separation to begin with. If now we have to go back and redetermine if there's a genetic predisposition to having an advantage.
Well, one of the interesting sports that has never had a gender separation is the triathlon. If you watch the Ironman championships, the men and the women compete at the same time in the same distances. Now, in the Ironman event, the top female athletes will push, they can be high up with their male counterparts, because women really have a lot of advantage when it comes to those more endurance, those ultra endurance types of events. Men are generally built more for power, and women are more so for endurance.
So the Ironman, you mean the tire flipping and the wall climbing and the...
Yeah. No, Ironman triathlon is, and I hope I get the distances right if anybody knows for sure, but it's a swim, bike, run.
Okay.
So the swim, I think, is 2 miles. This is the Ironman. And then the bike is about 110 miles, and then they run a full marathon.
My brain is in American Gladiator.
Right.
Myself. Right. Anybody watch that show?
Yeah.
Well, I know you have something to share with us here.
Yeah, so I put together a little montage of my running heroines through the years. Yeah, I don't know. And I thought, can we play that top video? I thought I'd start with a little video from my alma mater, and it's really a recognition of the 50 years history of women's sports at Luther. This is a short little clip, but it's kind of fun.
That's a great video.
Yeah, it was just, it's a fun one, and I watch it every once in a while, and it makes me proud, of where I was able to go to school, because we had a lot of, we had a high participation level with sports, and it was seen as kind of a normal thing, and it was just really nice to be in that kind of environment. So I think going through some of my running heroines, the first one is Wilma Rudolph. Does anybody know Wilma Rudolph or know that name? I see a few nodding heads. I read about her, I remember as a little girl in grade school. And what was really striking to me about her story was that she was born prematurely, the 20th of 22 children. She had cerebral palsy, scarlet fever. She had to be driven once a week by her mother. They went out by bus with her. She went with her mother to receive treatments at a facility in Tennessee. And part of her treatment was to have massages every 4 hours by her family members. So her whole family provided that type of care. But can you imagine? I mean, a house full of that many children, and I guess that's extra hands. But I was just thinking about how much love and care she had growing up in a very difficult circumstance. She went on to have to wear braces and eventually worked her way to orthopedic shoes, and all the way to the Olympics. And she competed in the 1956 and the 1960 Olympics. In 1956, she ran, she got a bronze in the 4x100, and then in 1960, she ran the 100, the 200, and the 4x1, and they got, I believe she got gold in the 4x1. And so she was just an amazing, inspiring athlete. And she was also, at that time, of course, she was seen as a civil rights hero because she was, you know, a Black female athlete who overcame some of her difficult circumstances. And she was known as an advocate. Another interesting thing I learned about her, she dated Muhammad Ali for a little while. I didn't know that. I was like, oh, girl, that was good. So anyway, she was great. She's very inspiring. She died of cancer not too long ago, I think in 1994. Greta Weitz, she was one of my, I just loved Greta. And one of the reasons I love Greta, she was just an amazing, amazing athlete. But one of the things that really stood out to me, she was winning races and at the peak of her career, kind of when I was in junior high going into high school. And one of the things I loved about Greta, I remember, and it's not a victory for her, but I don't remember which race it was, probably, I don't know what race it was, but she was being interviewed after she had lost, and she was predicted to win this event. And she said, you know, whoever was a beater, I don't remember who it was, she said, she just ran a better race than me today. And she accepted that defeat with so much grace and humility. I thought that is something to emulate. And she won the New York City Marathon 9 consecutive times. That's never been replicated. She was completely dominant. And she just kind of ran it the first time on a whim. She had a steak dinner with a big old glass of red wine, and then she's out there the next day and she totally dominates and wins and broke the record. I mean, I could just go on and on. Does anybody know about Catherine Switzer? Yeah, I think, or Switzer, I think it actually is how you pronounce her name. There's a lot to this story, and I'm actually going to read a little bit from the Wikipedia entry. So Catherine Switzer was the first female to officially run. She walked on to a men's cross-country team and just asked if she could train with them. And the coach of that team said, sure, if you can cut it, was basically the thing. So she ran with that team, and she decided she wanted to try and run the Boston Marathon. And so her coach said, yeah, you can run it if you can do the distance. So they trained for the marathon and decided to run it together. So who's in the picture there is Catherine, and then there's her coach, and then her boyfriend at the time, who later became her husband. And what's happening in here is that she entered the race as Kay Switzer. She did not spell out her name. So they did not identify her as female. There was no rules that she could not compete in the Boston Marathon. But they didn't really allow women to compete. Bobby Gibbs had tried to compete the year before, but she said, I'm just going to try and do this. So they're running along, and the race director sees that this is a woman competing. He jumped off the media truck and tried to rip off her bib. And what you're seeing in this picture is him running up behind her, and her boyfriend, who is a football player, you know, body checking him.
And what year was this, Mary?
This was in 1972. And so the next picture, kind of it's just a little bit close. You can see how violent it was.
Yeah.
She went on to finish the race, and you would have been very rattled by a violent attack like that. But she kind of thought to herself, I have to finish this race. And so I'm going to, Jock Semple was the name of the guy who assaulted her. Yeah, okay, so here's a real story. Jock Semple jumped off the following press truck and charged after Switzer. Semple was one of the marathon's indispensable characters, an irascible Scots-born former runner who described in Sports Illustrated as Mr. Boston Marathon. So he was a strict traditionalist who considered the marathon to be sacred and was well known in marathon circles for his custom of charging angrily after participants he found insufficiently serious about the race. So that was kind of his character. Um, um, anyway, she charged at Switzer and tried to rip off her numbered bib off of her running clothes to prevent her from continuing. In her memoir, she wrote, "Instinctively, I jerked my head around quickly and looked square in the face of the most, or square into the most vicious face I'd ever seen. A big man, a huge man with bared teeth was set to pounce, and before I could react, he grabbed my shoulder and flung me back, screaming, 'Get the hell out of my race and give me those numbers.'" So that's what she dealt with.
It looks like he has on regular shoes.
Oh, yeah.
Running pretty quickly to catch up with her. She should outrun him.
Yeah, oh yeah, she did. She finished in 4 hours and 20 minutes, which is much slower than what she should have actually raced that day. And she said, you know, her other quote is, "I knew if I quit, nobody would ever believe that women had the capability to run 26 plus miles. If I quit, everybody would say it was a publicity stunt. If I quit, it would set women's sports back, way back instead of forward. If I quit, I'd never run Boston. If I quit, Jock Semple and all those like him would win. My fear and humiliation turned to anger." Now, another interesting part of this story is that she and Jock reconciled years later, and she was actually with him as he was dying. And you know, she really was able to overcome that and that anger and that frustration, obviously, and the fear really from that event. I mean, most of us women walk around, you know, hoping we won't be the victim of a violent assault. One of the other quotes I wanted to share too is that she goes to the Boston Marathon regularly now, and her number's retired, so no one can run with the number 261. And she said, "When I go to the Boston Marathon now, I have wet shoulders. Women fall into my arms crying. They're weeping for joy because running, oh, it makes me emotional, has changed their lives. They feel they can do anything." So anyway, I didn't think I'd get emotional about that. But to me, you know, that bravery of some of these early female athletes was just paved the way for the rest of us. It was just amazing. After this event, the AAU banned participation from women from the Boston Marathon for I don't know how long. I mean, it really led to a fight with the American Athletic Union about women being able to participate at all. So that's Catherine. She's really an amazing athlete.
Many of the women that you've already heard one or the second one, you're speaking about leadership qualities.
Yes, yes.
And qualities that I think resonate if you're not an athlete.
Exactly, exactly. Joan Benoit Samuelson. So this was the 1984 women's first Olympic marathon. So there's two pictures. The one on your left is her crossing the finish line, and you can see the packed stadium behind her, and there's a story to that. And then the one on the right, she's, of course, in the gold, she's a victor. And then Greta Weitz is then to her left, or to your left as you're looking at the picture. So Greta finished second in that first marathon. What was interesting about Joan, when she was interviewed afterwards, she said it was in Los Angeles, and they finished obviously in the Coliseum, and she was running the route, and it was a hot, hot day. It was miserable conditions, and I remember watching this race because it was so historic. And when she was interviewed later, she was coming into the stadium, and she could not believe the crowds. She said, "It's 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Nobody cares about women's running. Like, what's the big deal?" And she comes in, and there's this crowd standing on their feet cheering for her. And it was really special. And one other interesting thing about her is that she had to have arthroscopic surgery on her knee 60 days, I think, before the Olympic trials. Somehow she was able to recover from that surgery. It's unheard of. And run well enough to qualify in the trials and then prepare for the actual race.
And this was a marathon.
What's that?
This was a marathon.
This is the first. Yeah, not easy. And then Mary Decker. So Mary Decker Slaney, she was a very prolific runner. Her biggest disappointment is her injuries and her running history did not give her the Olympic victories that she wanted. What she's probably the most known for is that this was the 1984 Olympics also, and it was the first women's 3,000 meters, and she was a heavy favorite. She stepped on the track, she won. She was just that good. But the other interesting kind of story that went with this is Zola Budd was, I think 17 at that time, was an athlete from South Africa, very inexperienced young girl who was extremely talented. She'd never competed in these kinds of races. There's a lot of elbowing and a lot of jockeying around for position, and it's the experienced athlete that competes at this level. Well, she hadn't had this kind of international experience. They get on the track. They end up, Zola had run out in front of Mary, and they clipped feet, and Mary went down, and she could not complete the race. I don't know what the injury was, but she could not complete the race. It was an international controversy because of the track rules around, did Zola Budd impede her progress and all of that. And anyway, Zola finished the race dead last, and Mary, of course, could not finish the race. And then Mary was very angry afterwards and was very critical of Zola even being there because of her lack of experience in an international track setting. And then Mary was kind of controversial because later in her career, she was coached by Alberto Salazar, who now has a lifetime ban from coaching track because of suspicions. Well, he was found to be doping his athletes, and she was found with high levels of testosterone. So there was some suspicion that she always denied it. It's never been resolved, but there was a little bit of controversy around Mary Decker. Francie LaRue Smith. Now, the funny thing about Francie, so what she's known for, there's two things I want to talk about with her. One thing is her span of distances. So she ran, I have to look at my notes, but she also competed from 1972 to 1992 at the Olympic level. So for the first 10,000 meters, which was in 1992, she placed fifth, and she was 37, 39, like in her late 30s, unheard of. Yeah, she was known primarily for the span of her career. One thing I forgot about to tell you about Joan Benoit Samuelson, she runs the Big 7, which is in Davenport, Iowa, and she's run that race for years and years and years. But what's fun about Francie is her span of her career. So again, she ran from 1972 to 1992 in all the distances. So she ran the 1,500 meter all the way to the marathon. And she was good at every single distance. So she was just a legend in her time. The other piece of this story is one of my twins came home, and he was looking for colleges, and he said, I'm going to check out Southwestern, which is in Georgetown, Texas. And we were living in Texas at the time. Jody said, his coach at the time said, you might know who the coach is, Francie something something. And I'm like, Francie LaRue Smith is coaching at Georgetown, and we're going on a campus visit? And I got to meet Francie and have lunch with her. And in her office is this huge photo, and I could not find it. There's not very many pictures of her online, of her waving the Olympic flag as she was at her peak at what I don't know which Olympic it was, but she was so down to earth. My son liked her a lot. He ended up not going there, but I could not believe that I got to meet her, talk about my son's running career, and then have lunch with her. Like, it was so cool. Alicia Montano. Now, I love Alicia. You can see the flower in her hair. And I got to watch her several times at the Drake Relay. She was an amazing 800 runner. But what I think about and love and respect about her is her advocacy for women, and especially women for their pregnancy, childbirth, et cetera, et cetera. She was a Nike-sponsored athlete who was a contract employee who was let go when she had her babies. She really could never come back professionally, once she had her children, even though she was a really good runner, but there was no support for her during her pregnancy. So Allison's next. So Allison is, well, she has more Olympic medals than Usain Bolt. She's the most decorated track and field athlete of either men or women. What I love about Allison, she doesn't run the events that I typically follow the closest, but what I've loved about Allison over the years is her integrity. She's very driven by her faith, her family. One of the stories that sticks in my mind about her is that there was a picture of her grandmother at one of the events. Or no, it wasn't it. She was talking about her grandmother at one of the events. Never saw a picture of her grandmother. Wish I would have. But the story she told is that her grandma could not watch the races. She'd wait for the race to be over to know how she did, and then she could watch. But she had a very strong family. She had very strong faith. She was one of those athletes with super high integrity, never a question about whether or not she doped, and she was so consistent. Now, her story about her pregnancy was that she developed preeclampsia, and she was a Nike-sponsored athlete. I mean, the most decorated Olympic athlete in history for track and field, male or female, totally dominant in her sport. And she was an independent contractor, and they did not provide any maternity benefits for her. So anyway, long story short, she had preeclampsia. Her little baby girl was born prematurely, and then she had complications postpartum. And I always worry about racial disparities in healthcare, but especially Black women, maternal and fetal death is so much higher. And here she was, an athlete in the prime of her life, and she was, one of those women who had, could have potentially had a devastating outcome.
And this is fairly recent.
Oh, this is recent, yeah, her baby. So look at this picture of her and her baby. And I got the chance to see her run in Des Moines on the Drake campus. And I don't remember which year, but her little girl was younger than in this picture. And she was just coming back. So her racing form was not at her peak, but she, of course, still ran brilliantly. But what I remember the most is we all stood up, and she got a standing ovation when her husband brought her baby to the track. We just all went nuts and just were so happy that the baby was okay, because the baby was premature. She had recovered, and she was competing again. But again, it's just an area where women kind of suffer a little bit. She didn't have the protections that she needed, and yet she's still competing at these high levels. Kara Goucher was really another athlete who was very accomplished. I mean, I could go through her statistics, but what was really interesting about her, and not to her liking, I would argue, she's going to be known for whistleblowing the Nike Oregon project, which was run by Alberto Salazar, who was a very good runner in his own right, but founded this project with Nike's support to develop track and field talent, because there was a real drought in the 90s in particular around the American distance running contingent. We weren't placing at World Cups, or not World Cups, but the World track meets, and we weren't competing well in the Olympics. And anyway, she was a student at Colorado University. She grew up in Duluth, went out to be a Buffalo, run with Colorado, and then transitioned into a pro career. She married one of her teammates, and he was pro as well. So they moved to Portland to be a part of the Oregon project. Well, I just finished a book that she just wrote. I think it's The Longest Race is the title of it, and she details what had happened to her during her time with the Nike Oregon project. And really it boils down to Alberto was an abusive coach, verbally, sexually, shamed her around her weight, would have public weigh-ins, tell her she was fat. I mean, look at her, there's no fat there. And then she suspected him of doping some of the other athletes. And two of the other athletes, Galen Rupp and Mo Farah, I both suspected of having some. I mean, I think what Alberto was doing, and I didn't do a deep dive on all the investigations through USADA and all of the other, it's just like, I don't need to know all the detail, but I think what happened is that he was doping right up to the limit. Like, he had it down to a science. Like, I can give you this much androgel and this much testosterone supplements, and I can do this much and take you right to the edge. But when I watch Mo Farah compete in the Olympics, I'm like, I just feel like he's doping because he was running too fast and the recovery was too quick. So they were doing like the 5,000 and 10,000 double races. Most athletes can't recover sufficiently to compete in both of those events. And he and Mo Farah and Galen Rupp, which were the two main athletes that Alberto was coaching, were competing in those events. So she blew the whistle on Alberto Salazar, and she suffered for it in many, many, many ways. But what a wonderful, but how courageous, you know. So anyway, oh, and my shoes that I'm wearing are Allison Felix's company's shoes. She has a company now, she does the shoe designs, and I could spend a lot of money.
So she's not branded with, not Nike?
No, I won't buy, yeah, nope, not Nike. These are her own brand. These are her styles. Seish is her brand. So yeah, so I support her. I buy her things to support her.
And Mary still runs. I don't know if we talked about that, but she runs every weekend. She does a long distance. I always know. She's like, I'm running. No breakfast here.
Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Those are the tour of my female heroes. I think the only other thing I would say, kind of thinking about the timing of these events, like in my high school career in particular, we did not get to run the open 2-mile as high school girls until 1982 when I graduated, and that would have been my best event. I was stuck with the 800 and the mile, and I didn't have enough finishing speed really to be good in either one of those events. I would have been much better at the 2-mile. So there, you know, it did bother me because I just felt like I loved participating, I loved competing, had a great time, but it just was not. I wasn't given the same opportunities as the boys, and that bothered me.
During your sports career, I'll call it, and everything that you've accomplished, what do you take from your athleticism that you've applied in your role as the CEO of Unity?
I've been thinking about that a lot because I went down the rabbit hole kind of reminiscing about all these women I've admired over the years, and the new one, there's more coming along, of course, that I admire. But I think the thing that I take away from my day-to-day life and my leadership roles is that I think, especially in running, I think other sports are like this too, but that's the one I know the best. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of planning. You have to go out and run when you don't want to, if you're going to be, and you have to do other things really. Now, back when I was competing, like we did 30 sit-ups, 30 push-ups, lifted weights in the off season, thought that was cross training. We didn't know anything, you know. We're like, we're tough, you know. Now it's much more detailed and there's a lot more that we know. But to me, it teaches you perseverance, discipline, how to work with a team. I learned so much from my teammates and from the coaches that I've had through the years about how to work with a team, especially in cross country. You know, there's, on any given day, you know, you have your top 5 that score, but you have 7 athletes running. So your number 1 could have a day where they're number 4, but your number 5 could be number 1 that day. So you learn how to have that give and take, and you never know when it's going to be somebody's day. And most championship teams have somebody who outperformed any expectation anybody ever had. And a lot of that has to do with the love for your teammates, the desire to do well. So I think the team atmosphere, the discipline, the training, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, being able to tolerate disappointment, keep going, all of those things apply.
They're great lessons. The relay is one that resonates mostly with me because you have to identify where to put people to get the best result, right? And we're working towards the same result, but someone may do this better than this piece, and strategically assigning people those roles to help get the task done.
So I have a real quick story about that. So I had a lot of really good running friends in Iowa, and one was my friend David, who was an obsessive about, like, he was the kind of guy who on long runs would recite the Olympic gold medalists for the different events from, I don't know, whatever. Like, that's the way his mind was, just brilliant. And he was very interested in my youngest son's career because Karsten's best event was the 800, which was his best event. So they had qualified for state, and David and I were on a run that morning, kind of ruminating about the race, and the discussion was what should Karsten's leg be? Because he was either their third or fourth slowest. I'd have to think about it. I think he might have been their slowest, on paper, their slowest runner, but he was a senior. And he's so tall. He was 6'4" at the time. Now he's 6'5". So there's a danger there in those tight races as to how he's going to have enough room to run and all of that. So we were going, should he be first? Should he be third? Because they'd said, we think Karsten should be first. And we're kind of like, should he be first? Anyway, we were running down the path, and up comes my neighbor, who actually was his head coach, comes running the other way. And we're like, guess what we're talking about? He's like, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about what leg should Karsten run, what leg should all the other boys run. So yeah, it's pretty funny.
Well,
we're done. I think we're almost done.
Does anyone have any questions? Mary, this is a great opportunity. I truly enjoyed the presentation, but we take away the recognizing athletes, but mostly the lessons that have come from parents of all of these great athletes. Thank you. And Mary, we'd like to give you this gift of flowers.
Thank you. Thank you. I love this.
I don't want to rob anyone from the opportunity to ask any burning questions that they may have. The good news is, if you don't have one now, you will be seeing her around, because she is part of our family here.
Yeah.
Our UnityPoint and soon-to-be Carl family, and the collaborations between the two institutions will not cease. They'll only become stronger. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.